Republicans dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
No, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I am your host, Rick Wilson, as always. Glad you're with us. We have a very interesting guest today. As you know, we like to bring you smart folks who can really give us an insight into what's happening in the country right at this minute. And Talia Lavin is with us today, and she has a phenomenal new book called Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. And I'm happy we have Talia today because the election is coming up almost instantaneously now. And one of the strongest groups that backs Donald Trump, no matter what, are evangelical Christians. And they're doing it in part in a way that is mysterious to some Americans, but not to Talia. She has studied this very closely and talked and thought about the political implications of what they're doing. So, Talia, I ask every author this question: what was it that motivated you to write this book at this moment in time?
So my first book, Culture Warlords, my journey into the dark web of white supremacy, was about sort of self-proclaimed extremists, neo-Nazis, and would-be terrorists, incels, people who really defined themselves as outside the mainstream. And then, that came out in 2020. And as the years have progressed, I noticed that stuff that I had seen only in literally neo-Nazi Telegram channels, like protesting drag queen story hour, and, similar anti-trans rhetoric, anti-woman rhetoric, I noticed suddenly was being parroted by Republican officials, including Congress people, that it essentially had become the mainstream, that the mainstream was polluted, like Cuyahoga River set on fire kind of polluted. And so I realized that my next book had to be a sort of how did we get here pressy, and like an explanation of just how did the mainstream get so polluted with filth that were so receptive to these messages that would have seemed, that did seem outre and radical even just a couple of years ago. And I found that the strongest thread and the strongest story explaining this relentless push towards the right and towards autocracy was actually the story of the Christian right, and particularly how it treats women and children.
So as you started looking into this, you do note right off the top, and this is something that as a ex-Republican, this was certainly something that was always part of the Republican Party's backbone for the last 50 years, was the Christian right. And for a long time, their power inside the party was moderated because the Republicans had something called the three-legged stool. And one leg was social conservatism, one leg was economic conservatism, and one leg was foreign policy conservatism. Now, the foreign policy part has completely fallen apart on the right. They're now isolationist, Putinist, etc. The economic part is 100% tariffs now. That's gone. So basically, they're the last leg standing of the party, the last part of the Republican Party that has a truly powerful base somewhere. Talk to us about how they've changed since the beginning of Trump entering the picture, because I think actually you could categorize it as when Obama was elected, but I think it really, that may have catalyzed it, but I think it really became juiced when Trump came out on the stage. Talk to us about how Trump and the evangelical right have sort of transformed one another.
Yeah, I mean, you will still see, even a decade into this very loving and close partnership, this sort of bewilderment from people of how are evangelicals so close to Trump when he's this adulterer and he, has been, adjudicated and also just personally bragged about sexual assault. When these people claim to be sort of the guardians of America's morality, there's a sense of like bewilderment at how close these two forces are. But, there's a couple of different aspects to that. So one, pretty much instantaneously, when it became clear that Trump had the momentum in 2016, the rationalization you saw from evangelicals was essentially that, some of the more florid expressions of it was that Trump was sort of the prophesied return of Cyrus the Great,
Oh, yes.
the Persian emperor.
The Cyrus argument.
Yeah, exactly. The Persian emperor who allowed the Jews to leave exile and rebuild the Second Temple. So he's the flawed vessel for God's will.
Mm-hmm.
He may be this heathen, he may not be of the faith or whatever, but he is the tool that God has chosen. And there are, of course, textual proofs and prophecies to back it up, but really that was the fundamental rationalization. I think personally it also, that was the sort of top line, and then underneath, this is a movement with its roots in segregationism, with a very profound streak of misogyny and vicious anti-feminism. And so I think, there's a lot of rationalization of what was essentially a better fit than, they wanted to admit, while still retaining this moral high ground, or this idea that they're bastions of moral purity, as opposed to just being really weird about sex and like hating women, which, based on my based on spending the last 3 years like buried in this world, I think it's much more the latter than the former. But they have very good PR, and so and then why have they stuck with him? Well, I mean, he said he would give them what they wanted, and he did. I mean, he overturned Roe v. Wade. He appointed the judges that overturned Roe. Mm-hmm. He moved the embassy from, the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to service their, creepy end times fantasies. He has expressed support for Christian homeschooling and vouchers and all of these sort of, and certainly countenanced all of the anti-feminism, hostility towards gay and trans people. Whether or not that squares with his personal beliefs, which are some sort of acrid jumble, I don't think really matters. What matters are the people he surrounds himself with and their priorities. And basically, you had this running wish list of things, Roe being at the very top, that he granted them and promises to grant them again. So what they're getting out of the partnership is essentially the theocratic autocracy that they've been longing for so long. I mean, I think we've seen the movement accelerate and have its goals sort of amp up in response to the general extreme nature of Trump's rhetoric, so that they have become even less democratic than they were. And we've seen their dreams expand accordingly, so that the dream they have of the second Trump presidency, or Trump and Führer for life sort of situation, is really a theocratic kingdom of Christ on earth, starting in America, greatest country in the world. And it sounds immoderate. It sounds like, this person's exaggerating. But if you actually look at the speeches given by these evangelicals that attend Trump rallies, if you look at the groups that, were waving the crosses on January 6th and read their publications, I mean, they make it very clear that they have this sweeping and deeply unpopular social agenda they want to impose on the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And it is that agenda that they need a Trump-type character to execute. It is that agenda they need someone like Donald Trump to pull off. They can't do it. I mean, despite the fact that they are still the majority of the religious practice in the country, they still aren't popular enough to make it happen without sort of a big infrastructure, a political cover, if you will, that, gives them the power to, put legislative and policy heft behind the crazy ideas.
Yeah, or just the zealous ideas. Like, they're not crazy. They're crazy like a fox, right? They all hang together. They're theologically consistent. So on a national level, I think that is the case. Certainly, I think many Americans, millions of Americans, are living under de facto theocracies right now, in states with abortion bans, states with anti-trans laws, states where legislators keep introducing sort of more and more of this very overtly Christian theocratic social agenda. But like broadly, nationally, this is very unpopular. It's super invasive, and it doesn't stop at abortion. Not that that isn't a world historical catastrophe. It's about taking away birth control. It's about bringing back sodomy laws, really invasive stuff. The thing about theocracies is that they have this habit of being really interested in your junk and what you do with it. And, the sort of mind your own damn business, like get out of my bedroom approach to this kind of agenda, I think does resonate with more Americans than it doesn't. And abortion restriction continually loses whenever it's put up for a popular referendum, even in red states.
As a Florida resident, I can tell you the level of creepiness about the intrusive stuff is they haven't even started on how weird they are. We've got DeSantis's people right now, his staffers are looking into how can you buy commercial period tracking application data to make sure those women aren't getting out of hand. I mean, it is disturbing on the one hand, but it is also sort of predictable on the other. There's a lot of folks in that world who really, really, really want to know everything in your business.
I think the reason why I would want people to read Wild Faith is because what I'm just telling you is how the picture hangs together and what the goals are. And once you understand sort of where they're coming from and what they want, you can be more prepared and more braced and not surprised. Of course they want to buy menstrual, of course they want to track your menses and, generally act like witch finders. And when you look at who sort of, this is more of a combo of sort of gleaning from both my books and just the last decade of political journalism. If you look at who young Republicans are, if you look at who the staffers are, it's this combination of sort of these Christian kids who've been homeschooled and groomed to be the quote unquote Joshua generation that destroys secular government, and like 4chan neo-Nazis. And there is some overlap, especially
Sure.
the trad cath kind of recent Catholic convert types. So yeah, I mean, white Protestant evangelicals are only 14% of the population. Add in reactionary white Catholics, and that's another couple 10 million. But we're not looking at majorities of the US population. What we are looking at is this phenomenally organized movement that has been building and building and building and trying everything and throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks for 50 years. And this is in many ways the apotheosis of this moment. And I would also say that it is not surprising when you take a look at the sort of internal culture of particularly evangelicals. And I'm talking about, a lot of what I did for the book was review internal literature. So homeschool curricula, parenting manuals, marriage manuals. If you look at those texts, review, sort of several decades of the most just flesh-creepingly horrifying marriage and parenting advice you could imagine. This is an internal culture that is very authoritarian. Their family model is extremely authoritarian. All the parenting guides describe beating your children into obedience. The father as having absolute control over the household, and the wife as sort of the submissive co-enforcer. And the children, your goal is to have a child who is obedient, not necessarily smart or curious or kind, but the chief virtue is obedience. And that having those obedient children who will like instantly come to you as soon as you say, come here. That's a form of witnessing to the outside world. Look how obedient my children are. And we saw this week with Tucker Carlson's bizarre spanking rant in that rally in Duluth.
I can't seem to escape that story. It's so weird and yet so on brand.
Well, try having just written a book that talks about corporal punishment. Everybody tagged me in that video. They're like, look, what you said about corporal punishment creating authoritarians is true. And I was like, yeah, I know. I spent years on this, and he just tweeted it out. Yeah, no, but it's like, who does that message? Dad is home and he is upset and he's going to hurt you.
Yeah,
Who does
daddy's
that
coming to
resonate with?
spank you. Tucker's
Yeah,
got some deep issues.
they all do though. Like the crowd was like baying with approval, and they shouted, "Daddy's home!" Right? So who does that message resonate with? That resonates with people for whom an authoritarian family model is something they've experienced or something they laud. You also have the linguist and philosopher George Lakoff talks about conservative authoritarians having the strict father model of
Yes. Mm-hmm.
the state. So I think what we're looking at here is, okay, you can compare the state to an authoritarian family, but there's also the inverse. If you have an authoritarian family culture, what you're doing is inculcating authoritarians, people who are accustomed to brutality, people who associate authority with obedience and with violence, and people who are, trained to this instant joyous obedience. And that is not a particularly democratic set of values to bring. Multiracial, multi-creedal democracy is chaotic, and it's all about coalitions and, the consent of the governed and all this stuff. And that doesn't necessarily mesh well with this authoritarian family model and this, desire for theocracy. So these are fundamentally incompatible.
So as we've watched the last few years, the idea that Trump is the object of God's will, and he's the chosen vector for their religious triumph in American culture, I've not really seen society pushing back very effectively on this. I haven't really observed that the rest of the culture gets what they're up against.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, what's interesting to me is that most of what I did was put together stuff that was publicly available. Like, I'm not doing some sort of McCarthyist quest where I'm like, what do you secretly believe? I'm just like, no, what have you said in speeches and talked about for decades and written in these books that have sold millions of copies, about what you want and what your vision for the country is. But I think there is a persistent belief among, certainly among the media and also among sort of your typical liberal, that everyone is sort of a rationalist, skeptic, pretty much secular person at heart, that they can't really believe that and they can't really want that, or you can't really have this confluence of zealous faith and tremendous desire for temporal power. And I would just say there's this chronic problem of really measuring other people's wheat by your own bushel and saying, everyone kind of secretly thinks like me. And I'm like, well, no, this is a totally different set of beliefs. This is a completely different world. It has its own material culture. It has its own internal sort of books and movies, cartoons and TV shows and publications that are written not for you, that you've never encountered, because they weren't written for you. And if you examine these internal documents, and if you talk to, as I did, if you interview, I think I interviewed about 150 former evangelicals about their experiences of child rearing, gender roles, and politics, you very quickly understand this is a totalizing religious environment that has its own set of values that are really fundamentally about combining this zealous and absolutist faith with conquest. One of the more interesting, sort of very explicit statements of this comes from the New Apostolic Reformation, is this Christian movement that is, I mean, they're non-denominational because they're kind of too out there for most mainline denominations. This is a very charismatic, Pentecostal type movement. It involves a lot of people declaring themselves prophets and apostles. And they are very intent on, in order to bring about the second coming, establishing a kingdom of Christ on earth right now, starting in the US. So that one of the big guys in this movement, this prophet named Lance Wallnau, co-wrote.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, he's the Cyrus prophecy guy too. He co-wrote a book called The Seven Mountain Mandate, which comes from Isaiah, about like God shall be on the mountain. But he talks about the seven mountains of American society, and it's I think it's family, business, media, politics, and so on. And it's really that the end goal of the Seven Mountain Mandate is Christians should gain control over each of these seven mountains. God's house shall be on the mountain. You know, it's about Christian dominion, or dominionism is another word for this kind of philosophy.
Right.
Christian dominion and control over all of these elements of American life, essentially total Christian control of American life. So when you tell people, you know, people are like, well, what are their ambitions? And you say they're boundless. I mean, they're talking about
the complete
total
recasting
control
of all culture and society. How about that?
Yeah, like plus, you know, making it illegal to like not be pregnant all the time if you are a woman, and, you know, illegal to have sex if you're gay. I mean, like if you ask what they want, it is nothing short of a kingdom of heaven. And so it makes absolute sense to me that they would be teaming up with a self-proclaimed autocrat, because what they're looking for is autocracy. And not only is it sort of innate to the culture, this element of authoritarianism, but their goals can only be accomplished through that kind of absolutism.
Right. There's nothing else there that can be, especially in a pluralistic constitutional democracy. There's nothing else they can accomplish unless they have radical amounts of state power.
Yeah, and to be clear, like they've accomplished a lot of their goals. Like Roe is gone. Millions of American women are living under this sort of could my pregnancy end in death kind of regime. You know, trans kids and trans folks all over the country are moving states, fleeing. We have internal refugees over these policies already. So, you know, they have been extremely successful. And I think, you know, just as the states are famously laboratories for democracy, they're also laboratories for theocracy. And so what we see in states like Oklahoma and Arkansas and Idaho, you know, these are predictive of what we could see from a federal government under Trump.
So do you think that at this point, there's any kind of greater clarity in the minds of folks on the center and the left that when they say they're going to do these things, they mean it? Because I think that Roe, my progressive friends who were surprised by the developments in the overturning of Roe, I was always sort of blown away. Like, how did you not see this coming? You had to know this was coming. You had to be aware. They told you over and over. So do you think they're listening now with a sharper ear to the threats that this movement poses?
I mean, gosh, I hope so. And I think the other people who are sort of screaming, of course they were overturning Roe, were the feminist journalists who had been tracking abortion restrictions for years and saying they're going to overturn Roe. That's what they want to do. You know, so, and I think this goes back to the bushel problem that we talked about, of just like, you can't really believe that. You can't really want that, because that seems so illogical to me. And it's this very sort of myopic, inadvertently self-centered view, I would say, blinkered view. And I would certainly hope that, you know, my big guiding principle, both in covering, you know, in covering extremists of every stripe, is that the best guide to knowing what someone believes and what they want to do is to listen to what they say they believe and what they want to do. Because generally when people are putting out this sort of propaganda, particularly if you're examining internal sources, sort of communiques within the community, like these are predictive. They are not sort of even shaped by PR. This is what folks are telling you they want to do. And they're saying it loud and they're saying it proud. And I would certainly hope, and I hope that readers of my book come away with this message of just, yes, they really do believe this. And the other reason I think why it's so hard to wrap your head around the viewpoint of the Christian right is that of people engaged in spiritual warfare. And I know you've heard that phrase a lot.
Oh, yes.
So what spiritual warfare doctrine sort of means, and this is very widespread on the Christian right, is that the world is composed of a small group of good and righteous Christians who are constantly at war with Lucifer and his minions as manifest in their political enemies. So,
Right.
That's why we saw, these QAnon sort of Christian and inspired images where Hillary Clinton was in league with the devil and drinking the blood of children. But even in the sort of more mainstream stuff, you really do have this idea that demons are alive and well on planet Earth and here and making the decisions and guiding the quote unquote Democrat party.
Oh, yes.
So from, yours and my perspective, or perhaps the median listener of this podcast, you're like, that's crazy. How can you believe that this election is about defeating Satan? But from their viewpoint, it's like, well, how are you just so fixated on the material world that you can't see the spiritual reality of what's around you? Don't you see you have to don the whole armor of God? And, the truth is that listeners of this podcast have been drafted into the spirit war that began before they were born. And you're sort of, you may not know it, but you're an unwitting soldier of the devil. And that is how you are viewed by members of this community with disproportionate political power. So, what we're seeing is how far would you go to defeat Lucifer? And that is really where they're coming from. And that's pretty, it is chilling, but it also happens to be true. And I wish I was bullshit too. I wish that all the stuff that I had uncovered, or just learned, right alongside you, because I'm Jewish, like I didn't grow up with any of this. The stuff that I just learned by listening and talking to people and reading what they said. I wish that this was a fantasy or even a fringe community, but it's not. They have tremendous amounts of political power, and their goals, again, are just as absolute as defeating the devil.
I used to joke with people all the time, like, don't do too much with the Handmaid's thing. It's way too on the nose. It's way too over the top. And now I kind of don't think it's as over the top as I used to think it was. I mean, there are people that would love to see that scenario play out in our world now.
I would just point out that, like, Margaret Atwood wrote that book in 1985 in response to the rise of people like Jerry Falwell and Phyllis Schlafly and, Ralph Reed and sort of the progenitors of the religious right. So the reason why it resonates so much now is because we are at the apotheosis of the movement that inspired her to write that dystopia. So the reason why it feels like we're in The Handmaid's Tale is because we are. Like, this is the dream of the people that inspired her to write that book.
It is a culture war that is going to be with us for some time now. So once again, I want to thank Talia Lavin for coming on the show today. Talia, thank you so much. Folks, the book is Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. Available everywhere fine books are sold. I strongly recommend it. It is a real look inside one side of the culture war, and it is the side that is armed and ready and very intentional. Thanks again for listening to The Enemies List. You know who's on the list this week? All the critics of John Kelly. I am no fan of John Kelly. I am no John Kelly stan. I wish John Kelly had spoken honestly earlier, but he has spoken now. He has told us that Donald Trump is a guy who wanted Hitler's generals, who said Hitler did some good things. And I took some criticism the other night because someone said, oh, well, you once said if you're accusing somebody of Hitler, you better have somebody on tape saying it. Well, guess what? We do. We have John Kelly saying it. We have now about a dozen senior national security officials who worked in the White House and worked with John Kelly, who also contemporaneously were aware of it. Now, again, thanks for coming out now, folks, but It's the critics of John Kelly and the critics of the folks that have now verified John Kelly's story and the critics of The Atlantic, where Jeffrey Goldberg's absolutely outstanding piece, and the critics of the New York Times, who had got John Kelly to actually do these interviews on tape so you hear him saying the words that Donald Trump is a fascist. The reaction on the MAGA right to this has been so hyperbolic, rip shit, over the top, cuckoo pants, crazy town, that it tells you a one key thing. And that's that John Kelly's telling the truth. They know who this guy is. They know exactly what this guy is. People don't fool themselves anymore about what Donald Trump's character is. People don't think to themselves, well, maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe Trump is not what I think. Maybe there's some world where this is a mistake, or this is some random, misfire, or this is something about him that I don't understand. No, everybody gets it now. And here's the thing. Just as a reminder, a cultural, historical reminder, as I think you are all aware, Trump is a guy who tells you what he is and who he is and what he believes. He likes Hitler. He thinks Hitler's strong. This is a guy who embraces every dictator, authoritarian, fiend, weirdo, creepy, police state asshole in the world. From Putin at the top of the food chain to Duterte at the bottom. Duterte's gone now, but you get the picture. Nothing about that is part of American political mainstream. Nothing. There is no acceptable world in which someone says, I want to be president. Oh, and by the way, I'm a big fan of Adolf fucking Hitler. So the people that are reacting to Kelly's revelations, and by the way, this is not a new story for most people who've been inside that brain of Donald Trump like myself. The people who are reacting to this, calling Kelly a traitor, saying he needs to be killed, saying he needs to be deported, put in Gitmo, arrested, blah, 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 all that, they're doing it for one simple reason. And they know that reason is because Donald Trump is who Kelly has described him as. They know that Donald Trump is a fan of authoritarians. He's a fan of Putin. He's a fan of Kim Jong-un. He's a fan of Xi. He's a fan of the most dictatorial and brutal people in the world today. And so the critics of John Kelly should beware of something. They should know this is coming. Just like everything else Trump does to his followers. Right now, he's watching. Who's defending me on the Hitler matter? He's watching you. Okay? And once you defend him on it and say, oh, Kelly's lying, obviously Trump's not a pro-Hitler person. Once you do that, Trump will make your humiliation more complete.